There is no physics in dreams. There is no hierarchy in death. Episode 1. A Mind Awakened. I remember the exact moment the idea struck me, a fleeting but thunderous epiphany that nearly caused me to drop my lab notes onto the polished floor of the University of Chicago's chemistry building. It was not during a class, nor during an erudite lecture, but rather in the aftermath of a most unorthodox experience, one that I, a once rigid-minded professor, never dreamed I would embrace. A psychedelic journey undertaken in the desperate hope of alleviating my chronic, debilitating depression. I was sitting at my oak desk, the afternoon light filtering through the tall, stately windows that overlook the main quadrangle. It was a few days after the experience, and I was still delicately piecing together the fragments of insight and confusion left behind. My name is Dr. Charles Whitmore, and I have taught advanced inorganic chemistry here for nearly 3 decades. I once prided myself on unwavering rationalism, on the empirical solidity of the periodic table and the interplay of electron orbitals. Yet, in the swirling chaos of that recent trip, guided by a meticulously chosen therapist in an off-campus setting, I found myself face to face with a radical notion. Consciousness might not be a mere afterthought of physical processes in the brain. Instead, consciousness itself could be the very foundation from which physics emerges. The event that precipitated this shocking revelation was unplanned. My depression, a shadowy companion for years, had grown more tenacious. Standard pharmacological treatments were failing. Therapy sessions offered only meager solace. In desperation, and upon the advice of a colleague in the psychiatry department who had connections to some cutting-edge and not entirely sanctioned research, I agreed to try psilocybin under controlled conditions. A single session, with carefully measured doses, profoundly changed me. It is difficult to describe the kaleidoscopic visions that emerged, each one layered with hyperreal patterns, fractal geometries, and uncanny emotional truths. More astonishing, however, was the sense that my awareness was somehow prior to the swirling shapes. They seemed to spring forth from a deeper well of being, an ocean of awareness that felt eternal, quiet, yet alive with infinite potential. At one point, as I was dissolving into the music that played softly in the therapy room, a phrase, unbidden and almost cryptic, echoed through my inner space. There is no physics in dreams. It struck me so powerfully that I opened my eyes, trying to speak it aloud to the therapist at my side, but my mouth could only shape half words. The meaning resonated, though, reverberating through every neuron in my brain. I spent the subsequent days in a haze of reflection. As a scientist, my first impulse was to dismiss these drug-induced epiphanies as hallucinations or mental distortions. Yet I could not ignore the ring of truth in them. A dream is indeed a reality of sorts, at least to the dreamer. But it is a reality ungoverned by the classical laws of physics. Things morph, shapes shift, logic bends. And yet, within that dream, the experience is fully real to the conscious subject. Could it be that, in some deeper sense, our waking world operates similarly? That its stable patterns spring not from an inert, mindless matter, but from the primal canvas of consciousness, shaping itself into the illusions of space, time, and matter? I felt as if a hidden door had opened, and with it came both excitement and trepidation. After all, I had devoted my life to the rigorous study of chemistry. I believed in molecules, in the laws that dictated how atoms combined or decayed. Quantum mechanics fascinated me, but always from the stance that it was describing an objective physical reality, albeit one that defied common sense. Could it be that quantum weirdness was in fact a clue that the physical world is not fundamental at all? Instead, might it be a manifestation of a universal mind, an infinite consciousness from which matter arises? These questions looped in my mind like a Mobius strip, turning inside out and back again. I began reading voraciously. Psychedelic research, Eastern philosophies, the writings of quantum pioneers like Schrödinger, Pauli, Bohm, and even the more radical interpretations that pointed to consciousness as a foundational element. My nights became sleepless, my days tinged with a new kind of wonder and uncertainty. One bright morning, As the first snow of winter dusted the Gothic architecture of the campus, I received a call from a friend in the philosophy department, Dr. Emily Mortensen. She had heard through the grapevine of my transformative experience and invited me for tea in her office. Emily was known for her work on philosophy of mind and had co-taught seminars that bridged cognitive science and existential philosophy. I arrived in her office, a cozy room decorated with an eclectic mix of classical busts and Tibetan mandalas, feeling simultaneously awkward and relieved. "Charles," she said with a welcoming smile, "you look different." I chuckled nervously. "I feel different, Emily. I'm not entirely sure how to articulate it, but something shifted in me during that session. It's about consciousness, my sense that it might not be just a byproduct of the brain." Emily nodded, eyes bright with curiosity. "You're not alone in that thought. There's a lineage of thinkers stretching back centuries who suspect that mind is fundamental, not matter." She mentioned the philosophical tradition of idealism, the notion from George Berkeley, who famously claimed that existence is tied to being perceived, and more modern forms of monistic idealism championed by certain quantum theorists. I found it comforting, though slightly disorienting, that serious philosophers had grappled with these ideas. Still, it felt radical to me. As our conversation deepened, Emily leaned forward, her voice softening as though she were sharing a secret. "If you truly believe that consciousness might be fundamental, Charles, you might want to talk to different people, beyond academic philosophers. Seek out mystics, neuroscientists on the cutting edge of consciousness research, maybe even quantum computing specialists who see the boundary between matter and information as fluid." It was an intriguing invitation. For years I had stayed within the safe confines of my lab, content to dabble in cross-disciplinary discourse only when it was mandated by committee work or the occasional conference. But the time had come to venture out, both physically and intellectually. And so began my quest to explore this notion in depth, guided by that haunting phrase, "There is no physics in dreams." If consciousness indeed structures our reality, how might that change our understanding of technology, society, ethics, and our own fragile mental health? Could it even provide insights into mental conditions like my own persistent depression? Yet I had no illusions this would be simple. I was stepping off the well-trodden path of classical scientific inquiry into realms that many in my department would label as fringe or even pseudo-scientific. Still, something burned inside me, a sense of conviction, or maybe a sense of destiny. I decided to take a sabbatical, a radical step, but one I felt was imperative. My departure from routine gave me space and time to reflect, to pack a small suitcase, and to journey wherever curiosity beckoned. Over the coming months, I would traverse the globe, meeting scholars, shamans, quantum physicists, and ordinary individuals who had glimpsed extraordinary realities. Each encounter would bring me closer to understanding whether my revelation was a fleeting chemical imbalance or a genuine insight into the nature of existence itself. Before leaving, I prepared an empty journal, determined to document each step. I wrote on the first page in bold letters, "Reality is shaped by consciousness, and it may be that the laws of physics are a collective dream. There is no physics in dreams." I stared at those words, feeling a tremor of anticipation. As I closed the journal, a faint memory from my psychedelic journey fluttered into awareness, the sensation of boundless love, of the interconnectedness of all things. If consciousness truly undergirded reality, then everything, every leaf, every electron, every person, was part of a single, living tapestry. Leaving my lab that day felt like stepping out of an old identity. I was no longer just a chemistry professor. I was now a seeker, driven by a question that challenged the bedrock of my own scientific training. What if physics is simply a subset of consciousness, rather than consciousness being an accidental output of physics? I locked my office door, the metallic click echoing down the quiet hallway. With a mixture of trepidation and excitement, I walked away, unknowing that this journey would lead me into territories of mind and matter that would upend everything I thought I understood, including the very definition of understanding. Little did I suspect the extraordinary individuals who awaited me in the months to come. A blind Tibetan monk claiming to see the aura of photons, a flamboyant Silicon Valley entrepreneur building AI that runs on quantum consciousness, a tribal shaman who spoke of jungles as living, dreaming entities. Nor did I foresee the final surprise that would shake the foundations of both my newly forming worldview and my deepest sense of self. But in that moment, as I walked across the campus grounds with the crunch of snow beneath my feet, I felt strangely alive, quietly certain that the dream had only just begun. Episode 2. Crossing the Threshold. A week later, I found myself on an airplane bound for Dharamshala, India, with barely a plan except a scribbled address of a small monastery reputed to house a monk who had experienced a mysterious, life-changing realization about the nature of mind. The flight was long, and the hum of the engines lulled me into a light doze. Each time I closed my eyes, I saw flashes of the fractal patterns from my psilocybin journey, but now they were overlaid with a sense of purpose rather than dread. I arrived in the hill town by early evening, the crisp mountain air a welcome contrast to the hectic bustle of Delhi. The monastery, perched on a steep slope overlooking the Kangra Valley, was quiet except for the flutter of prayer flags and the distant chirping of crickets. I would later learn that many monks had fled Tibet and settled here. They carried with them centuries of esoteric knowledge about the mind, knowledge that might align with my new direction. After some introductions, I was guided by a novice through narrow stone corridors to a small courtyard. There, near a low wooden table adorned with a single candle, sat a monk clad in saffron and maroon robes. He was older, his face lined by years of meditation, and his eyes, one clouded with what seemed to be cataracts, were nonetheless clear in their gaze. "Professor Whitmore," he greeted, pronouncing my last name with surprising precision. "I have been told you seek insights on consciousness." I was taken aback for a moment by his directness. "Yes, Rinpoche, if I may address you so. I've recently come to believe that our ordinary view of reality might be inverted, that consciousness is primary and the physical world is secondary." He smiled gently, like a teacher pleased with an apt pupil. "This is not an uncommon view in Tibetan Buddhism," he said. "We speak of mind nature and how the universe is, in essence, mind manifesting. Physics, as you call it, is but the dream's laws, rules that consciousness imposes on itself for the play of phenomena." His words echoed my own hunches, and I felt a thrill of validation. I studied the intersection of quantum mechanics and philosophy in my youth, I admitted, but it always seemed too speculative. Now, I'm not so sure. We spoke for hours, and I learned that he was effectively blind in one eye since childhood. Yet during an advanced meditation retreat, he had experiences where he claimed to see photons, not as discrete particles, but as shimmering possibilities, dancing within an all-encompassing awareness. The details were reminiscent of quantum superposition. A photon is both a wave and a particle until observed. But in his meditative vision, the observer and the observed were one. "It's hard to translate into words," he confessed. "I might say that each photon is a crystallization of the infinite potential of consciousness, blinking in and out like sparks from a fire. We, the observers, collapse the wave into what we call reality. But in the deepest sense, there is no separation between photon and mind. They arise together." This was more than mystical wordplay. It seemed startlingly close to certain interpretations of quantum mechanics, like the participatory anthropic principle advocated by John Wheeler or the observer-centric ideas of Henry Stapp. My scientific training told me to be cautious. Subjective experiences can be deceiving. Yet a quiet part of me whispered that the old monk's accounts resonated with a hidden truth. I spent 3 days at the monastery, meditating at dawn with the monks, though my mind wandered incessantly, and discussing consciousness over cups of yak butter tea. The experience was at once alien and curiously natural. I found it humbling to stand in that courtyard at sunrise, listening to the distant roll of Buddhist chants and pondering whether these intangible mental phenomena might actually be the bedrock of reality. On my final day, just before departing for the airport, the monk offered a small hand-carved amulet. It bore a Tibetan script that he translated for me as, "The dream is not separate from the dreamer." We stood in silence for a moment. I recalled the phrase I had carried with me, the one that had haunted my trip: "There is no physics in dreams." Were these two statements pointing to the same insight? If mind and dream are one, then the physics we measure is simply the rules of a collectively dreamed world. Perhaps in the monastery's hush, I was hearing an ancient echo of that radical proposition. As I boarded my plane, I felt a new sense of grounding. Whatever path lay ahead, I sensed I was crossing a threshold from the narrow confines of empirical materialism into a vast vista of possibilities, where mind might conjure the illusions of matter, and the world might be more like an enormous mental tapestry than a clockwork machine. Episode 3: Silicon Valley Singularities. From the tranquil highlands of Dharamshala, my journey took a sharp turn to the frenetic pulse of Silicon Valley. I had arranged to meet a friend of Emily's, an entrepreneur and computer scientist named Victor Chen. Victor had garnered headlines for his biotech ventures, but had more recently shifted his focus to a secretive AI startup rumored to be harnessing quantum computing principles. Driving down Highway 101 in a rented electric car, I marveled at the futuristic campus architecture rising amid the palm trees and the crisp California sky. Victor greeted me at his facility's entrance, a glass and steel behemoth that looked more like a spaceship than an office building. "Charles, glad you made it," he exclaimed, with the exuberance of a man who considered sleep optional. "Heard you're on a quest about consciousness. Well, you've come to the right place." He led me through security checkpoints into a lab area where rows of quantum processors hummed in carefully calibrated cryogenic chambers. I watched wide-eyed as technicians in white coats floated from one station to another, adjusting superconducting cables and monitoring quantum error correction protocols on large screens. It felt like stepping into the next century. In a private conference room, Victor laid out his vision. "You know how classical computing is based on bits, zeros and ones. Here we've got qubits, quantum bits, that can be 0 and 1 simultaneously in superposition. That's the standard pitch," he said, waving a hand dismissively. "But the real revolution, in my view, is how this ties into consciousness. Some of us suspect that consciousness might be related to quantum coherence in the brain's microtubules, like Penrose and Hameroff theorized. Or perhaps it's more subtle, some non-local aspect of mind that resonates with quantum fields." I raised an eyebrow. "You're building AI based on that speculation. That's a bold leap." He grinned mischievously. "We're trying to create a system that doesn't just compute. We want it to experience. If consciousness is fundamental, as you're suggesting these days, then matter is basically an instantiation of conscious potential. We want to replicate the conditions under which consciousness emerges, right here in these machines." I felt a mixture of excitement and incredulity. "But are you certain your quantum AI will be conscious, or simply mimic the behaviors we associate with consciousness?" Victor sighed. "That's the crux, isn't it? Philosophers call it the hard problem of consciousness. But if consciousness truly undergirds reality, maybe it's not hard at all. Maybe once you create the right conditions, it's inevitable, like a radio tuned to the right frequency. The station is already out there, broadcasting. You just need to dial it in." We spent the next few hours touring the facility. I saw prototypes of quantum neural networks, algorithms for entangled pattern recognition, and futuristic VR headsets that purportedly tapped into the user's brainwaves to create more immersive experiences. Yet what fascinated me most was a small, locked room near the back of the lab. Through a window, I glimpsed a single workstation connected to what looked like a metallic sphere the size of a bowling ball suspended in a vacuum chamber. "That's our hush-hush project," Victor whispered, a hint of excitement in his voice. "We're calling it ALAYA. It's an acronym for Algorithmic Layered Awareness, but it's also a Buddhist term that means storehouse consciousness, the aspect of mind that contains all impressions, seeds, and karmic tendencies." A shiver ran down my spine. The synergy between ancient mysticism and cutting-edge tech was exhilarating, if not a bit eerie. That evening, Victor and I shared dinner in a swanky Palo Alto restaurant. Over plates of molecular gastronomy-inspired cuisine, foam reductions, edible vapor puffs, I asked him if he really believed physics was secondary to consciousness. He leaned back in his seat, swirling a glass of sake. "You're a chemist, Charles. You know that matter is basically interactions of subatomic particles guided by quantum fields. But quantum fields themselves might be emergent from something deeper, information, or mind, or both. The more I see these qubits entangle and correlate, the more I feel we're staring into some primal form of consciousness. It's not that we're forging consciousness from matter. It's that matter is crystallized consciousness. And once you realize that, well," he tapped his temple, "the sky's the limit." As I drove back to my hotel under the neon haze of Silicon Valley, 1,000 thoughts raced through my mind. Could technology truly replicate consciousness by simply playing with quantum effects? Or was something more elusive at play, something that, by its very nature, transcended computational modeling? Either way, my discussion with Victor hammered home the breadth of this consciousness is fundamental perspective. It wasn't just the purview of monks or philosophers. High-tech entrepreneurs, flush with venture capital, were betting on it too. I looked up at the glinting stars, partially drowned by the city's glow. Again, that phrase reverberated. There is no physics in dreams. If we were indeed living in a collective dream, whose dream was it? Did each mind dream a fragment, or was there one universal dreamer of which we were fractal parts? The questions multiplied, and I realized my depression had strangely lightened. Engaging with these mysteries, it seemed, had given me a renewed zest for life. And yet I sensed deeper mysteries ahead. If we could truly harness consciousness in a machine, what new ethical and existential questions would arise? We might be playing with the building blocks of reality itself, no longer as passive observers, but as dreamers capable of shaping the shared dream. That night, as I drifted to sleep in my sterile hotel room, I had a vivid dream of my own. I was back at the monastery, watching the blind monk hold a luminous photon in his palm. When he glanced at me, I heard a whisper in the wind. "You cannot replicate the infinite with a finite device." I awoke with a start, heart pounding, uncertain if the dream was a warning, a prophecy, or just the random firing of neurons. But if consciousness truly was the bedrock of all existence, the lines between prophecy, vision, and random neural chatter might be illusory. I jotted the dream down in my journal, turned off the bedside lamp, and tried to calm my mind. Tomorrow I would board another flight, continuing my quest. Little did I know that my next destination, deep in the Amazon rainforest, would push me to the edges of sanity and deliver revelations I had scarcely imagined. Episode 4. Into the Jungle of Mind. My next stop was the heart of the Amazon, guided by a contact who knew a reclusive shaman named Santiago. I flew into Manaus, then traveled by boat along the twisting Rio Negro until the forest swallowed the horizon. The humidity wrapped me in its dense embrace, and the cacophony of insects, birds, and distant howls formed a constant soundtrack. Santiago lived in a small settlement near the confluence of two rivers, an older man with grey-streaked hair and an intense gaze. When I explained my quest, how I sought insight into consciousness, he offered only a cryptic smile. "Professor, the jungle itself dreams," he said, in a deep, resonant voice. "We humans believe we dream the jaguar, the anaconda, the red macaw, but they dream us too. We are all strands in the same tapestry." Over the next few days, I witnessed Santiago's healing rituals. He used a brew made from local vines, ayahuasca. Though I had already experienced psychedelics, the idea of undergoing another such journey, especially in the depths of the rainforest, both intrigued and unsettled me. But Santiago insisted it was necessary if I truly wanted to understand the consciousness that underlies reality. One moonlit night, I joined a small circle of locals and travelers in a clearing. We drank the thick, bitter brew. The effect came on slowly, an intensifying hum in my ears, a vibratory quality to everything around me. Then the forest exploded into fractal geometry. Vines, leaves, and shadows merged into living patterns that pulsed with a presence, an awareness. Soon my sense of self dissolved, replaced by the overwhelming feeling that I was not just in the jungle, I was the jungle. I could feel the slow, colossal breathing of ancient trees, the silent language of fungal networks beneath the soil, the quicksilver perception of jaguars prowling in the darkness. It was an ecological mind, a tapestry of consciousness, weaving itself into myriad forms. Then, from the swirling vision, Santiago's voice emerged like a beacon. Or perhaps it was the voice of the forest, wearing Santiago's face. Do you see now? There is no physics here, only dreaming. The phrase struck me like lightning. There is no physics in dreams. A resonance of the same insight that haunted me. In my altered state, I saw the entire Amazon as a single conscious organism. The laws of biology, chemistry, these were approximations of deeper mental processes, the forms that universal consciousness took to present a coherent story to our human minds. My sense of time evaporated. For what felt like eons, I floated in an ocean of green awareness, glimpsing the countless births and deaths that fed the cycle of life. The rainforest was not merely matter, it was a living system of interconnected minds. If I dared to extend that idea, perhaps the entire universe was likewise, a cosmic ecosystem of mind. When the effects subsided, I found myself on the forest floor, tears streaming down my face, Santiago crouching beside me. He placed a hand on my shoulder. "You are not separate from anything, Professor." I nodded, still trembling. "So is that what all this means? That the physical world is an illusion created by consciousness?" Santiago closed his eyes, as though communing with some unseen presence. "Illusion is not quite the right word. It is a manifestation, a performance of the mind. But yes, the stage and the actors are all spun from the same substance, awareness." That night, I slept in a hammock slung between two ancient trees. My dreams were calmer, but no less profound. I dreamt of a giant serpent coiling around a galaxy, swallowing and birthing stars in a cosmic cycle, all while gazing at me with luminous eyes that reflected my own face. Upon waking, I jotted it all down in my journal, including this line from my dream. "The serpent's coils are time itself, but time is only a wave of consciousness." Before I left, Santiago gifted me a feather from a harpy eagle. "To remind you that the mind soars above all, even the laws you call physical," he said with a faint smile. I felt both enchanted and overwhelmed. My rational mind struggled to integrate these experiences. The chemist in me knew about chemical structures of alkaloids, about synapses flooding with neurotransmitters, but the part of me that had soared with the eagle knew there was more, a dimension where matter was not the root, but the fruit of something deeper. As the boat carried me away from the jungle's heartbeat, I replayed the visions and wondered how they would stand up against the scrutiny of mainstream neuroscience. Were these revelations simply illusions conjured by psychedelics, or had the brew peeled back the veil, offering a fleeting glimpse of the cosmos's underlying nature? Regardless, a single truth now felt undeniable. If consciousness was truly fundamental, then everything, atoms, cells, ecosystems, was alive in ways our materialistic worldview had never permitted us to imagine. The very concept of a dead mechanical universe seemed tragically impoverished. And as the sun set in vibrant hues over the river, I felt strangely at peace, even elated. in the knowledge that this quest was reshaping me from the inside out. Episode 5. The Ghosts of Reason. The next leg of my journey took me to Zurich, Switzerland, a place steeped in scientific and philosophical history. My mission was to meet a neuroscientist named Dr. Elsa Schneider, who had pioneered advanced neural imaging techniques that claimed to capture the subjective glow of conscious awareness. We met in her lab at ETH Zurich, a pristine facility brimming with cutting-edge equipment. Dr. Schneider was tall, with graying hair pulled into a tight bun, her sharp intellect evident in her piercing blue eyes. She wasted no time. "I've heard rumors of your new perspective," she said, handing me a lab coat. "That consciousness is fundamental, physics emergent. Let's put it to the test." She led me to a chamber where a volunteer lay inside a massive scanner that combined functional MRI with magnetoencephalography and a novel quantum sensor array. On a monitor, I could see swirling color patterns representing real-time brain activity. "This is a new generation of imaging," Dr. Schneider explained. "We're capturing electrical signals and subtle quantum effects in the microtubules. The challenge is correlating these signals with subjective reports of consciousness, qualia." As the volunteer was shown various stimuli, images of loved ones, abstract shapes, short videos, the readouts shifted in complex patterns. At times, faint luminescent flares appeared in certain neural networks, leading Dr. Schneider to hypothesize that these flares might represent the subjective aha moments of conscious recognition. Over dinner at a classic Swiss cafe, I asked her how her research fit with the idea that consciousness is not just a product of the brain, but the source of physical reality. She pursed her lips, considering her words carefully. "I'm hesitant to jump to the conclusion that mind precedes matter. However, the data suggests that there is an irreducible core of experience that doesn't neatly decompose into neural components. We can see the footprints of consciousness in the brain, but we can't see consciousness itself." I nodded, taking a sip of strong Swiss coffee. "So you're open to the possibility that consciousness could be a fundamental property, like mass or charge, just more elusive?" She leaned forward. "Yes, and perhaps more than that. Think of the quantum wave function. It's a mathematical abstraction, yet it underlies everything. Some interpretations hold that consciousness collapses the wave function. If that's true, then consciousness might be the cosmic orchestrator, selecting which potentials become actual." Her words sent chills through me. They resonated with the Tibetan monk's revelations, with Victor Chen's quantum AI, and with the Amazonian shaman's living forest. A pattern was emerging, an undercurrent linking disparate cultures and disciplines. The next day, Dr. Schneider demonstrated a particularly intriguing aspect of her work, a technology she termed neuro-interfacing for shared subjectivity. 2 volunteers wore advanced skullcaps that linked their brainwave patterns in real time. In certain induced states, one volunteer claimed to feel flashes of the other's emotions or images. As I watched, I recalled the concept of quantum entanglement, how 2 particles could remain correlated regardless of distance. Could it be that consciousness itself was a kind of entangled field, uniting seemingly separate minds into one universal mind? Dr. Schneider shook her head. "The phenomenon is inconsistent, and we can't fully replicate it. But sometimes something clicks, and it's like the boundaries between self and other melt away." My thoughts turned to my experience in the jungle, the sense of oneness with the entire ecosystem. Perhaps these volunteers were tasting a fraction of that same unity. On my last evening in Zurich, I strolled by the Limmat River, the water reflecting the city lights like shimmering jewels. I pulled out my journal and flipped through the notes I had gathered so far. Tibetan idealism, quantum AI, shamanic rainforest visions, advanced neural imaging. The synergy was uncanny. All these roads pointed toward consciousness as the route. Yet a nagging doubt lingered. Why then did we experience the world as so solid, so convincingly physical, if it was ultimately a mental tapestry? My rational mind demanded a mechanism, a blueprint for how universal consciousness conjured atoms, molecules, and the laws of nature. As I gazed at the reflections dancing on the river, a thought struck me. Maybe the cosmos is like a self-consistent dream. In a lucid dream, once you realize you're dreaming, you can sometimes alter its content. But as long as you remain unaware, the dream's logic appears unbreakable. Could that be why we perceive a rigid, rule-bound universe? Because we're collectively unaware that we are, in fact, the dreamers of it. I suddenly recalled the line that started this quest. There is no physics in dreams. Perhaps physics is the logic of our collective lucid dream, so seamless that we mistake it for unyielding objectivity. My mind spun with the implications. If we awakened, truly awakened, might the constraints of so-called physical law loosen, just as illusions dissolve upon recognizing a dream's nature? But who or what was behind the dream? Did an overarching intelligence steer it, or was it an emergent phenomenon of countless sub-dreamers? My quest was far from over. Tomorrow I would board yet another plane, heading to my final destination, a remote island in the Pacific, to meet someone who, I'd been told, existed entirely outside the framework of conventional reality. I slept fitfully, haunted by the possibility that everything I knew, everything I taught in my chemistry classes, might be akin to describing the water in a mirage. If consciousness truly anchored existence, then the entire scientific enterprise might be an elaborate storyline within a cosmic imagination. And what would that mean for me, for my identity, my depression, my role as a professor of a discipline that might be secondary to mind? No clear answers came, only the silent echo of the rivers of Zurich. Dream on, dreamer. Episode 6. A surprise beyond the dream. My journey's final leg took me across the Pacific to a small island shrouded in both mist and legend. A recluse named Oliver had been rumored to possess a rare gift. He experienced the world without the usual illusions of time, space, or self. Some claimed he was a living embodiment of non-duality, a man for whom the boundaries between subject and object had dissolved permanently. I arrived at the island via a rickety boat, stepping onto a beach of black volcanic sand. A local villager pointed me toward a bamboo hut perched near a cluster of palm trees. I approached cautiously, not knowing what to expect. Oliver turned out to be a thin, middle-aged man with piercing green eyes that seemed both alert and distant. He wore simple linen clothing, and his demeanor radiated an uncanny stillness. Without waiting for introductions, he invited me to sit on a wooden bench by the sea. "You've traveled a long way," he said in a soft voice, gazing out at the horizon. I nodded, explaining my quest. I came to believe that consciousness might be the ultimate substrate. I've sought confirmation from monks, scientists, shamans, and technologists, and I found a mosaic of evidence pointing that way. But something is missing, some final understanding that ties it all together. Oliver listened quietly, then finally turned his gaze to me. "You hold a puzzle piece in your hand, labeled Consciousness is Fundamental. Another piece you've labeled Physical Reality is an Illusion. You're trying to fit them together into a neat picture, yes?" "Yes," I admitted. He closed his eyes, the faintest hint of a smile tugging at his lips. "The ultimate finding you seek isn't something your mind can grasp the way it grasps chemical equations or quantum formulas. The mind that frames questions in terms of subject-object duality cannot comprehend that subject and object are the same." I swallowed, feeling a flutter of both frustration and anticipation. I understand the concept of non-duality, but the intellect alone isn't enough, is it? Oliver opened his eyes. "Exactly. Intellectual insight is only a sliver. True realization is a shift at the core of being, where the dreamer no longer sees themselves as separate from the dream." He paused, letting the sound of waves fill the silence. "You've carried a phrase with you. There is no physics in dreams. You interpret it as meaning that physics is illusory, that mind is the real. But there's another layer of truth. In a dream, yes, you can do impossible things. but you can also obey certain rules if you're not lucid. What if the ultimate realization is that there's no contradiction between the laws of physics and the primacy of consciousness? They are two faces of the same coin. One face is how consciousness appears as form, the other is formless awareness itself. They are not in competition. My chest tightened. Could it be that my quest had been guided by a false duality? The notion that if consciousness was fundamental, then physics must be not real? Oliver's words suggested that physics was as real as any aspect of the dream, yet wholly inseparable from consciousness. I told him about my attempts to reconcile quantum theory with mysticism, about my longing to find a definitive statement that yes, consciousness came first, matter second. He laughed softly. Even the idea that consciousness comes first, matter second, is a dualistic concept, separating them in time. In the deepest realization, there is no sequence, no first or second, only an eternal now in which consciousness is matter and matter is consciousness. A chill ran through me. I recalled the psychedelic visions, the quantum AI lab, the rainforest's living tapestry. All of them pointed toward a unity so profound it defied linear thinking. Could it be that my final revelation was not the triumphant affirmation of idealism over materialism, but the dissolution of that very dichotomy? The sun was setting in a blaze of orange and purple, the waves reflecting the sky's fire. Oliver stood, gesturing for me to follow him. We walked along the shore, the wet sand cool beneath our feet. "Charles," he said gently, "you've journeyed far, both outwardly and inwardly, to discover that the difference between consciousness and physics is itself part of the dream. Perhaps your next step is to wake up to the reality that contains both, yet transcends both." We paused, watching a seabird glide just above the water. Something in me surrendered then, a quiet relinquishing of the need to intellectually dominate the question. In that moment, the boundaries softened. I was the waves, the bird, the setting sun. I was the entire cosmic display, inseparable from the consciousness witnessing it. Tears welled in my eyes, not from sadness, but from an overwhelming sense of awe and release. For years I had fought my depression, wrestled with chemical imbalances and existential dread. In that ephemeral twilight, I felt a peace that surpassed all definitions, all concepts. The quest to prove consciousness was fundamental or to disprove physics suddenly seemed like a playful dance of illusions, a cosmic hide-and-seek between form and the formless. Oliver gently touched my shoulder. "What do you see?" I struggled to form words. "I see just this." He nodded, his smile filled with compassion. "That is all there is. Everything else is commentary." In the days that followed, I stayed on that island, lingering in an unfamiliar sense of calm. I wrote pages in my journal, though words felt increasingly inadequate, about the radical non-duality that made my original question both true and irrelevant. Yes, one could say consciousness is the substrate of reality, but also that reality is consciousness in motion. And yes, physics is real, but it's a reality sculpted by the selfsame consciousness. The ultimate finding was not the neat conclusion I had expected. It wasn't a triumphant banner proclaiming mind over matter. Rather, it was a dissolution of the very conflict between mind and matter, revealing a oneness that surpassed every dualistic framework. On my final day, Oliver handed me a small, polished stone. "A keepsake," he said, "to remind you that the stone and the awareness holding it are made of the same essence." I thanked him, embracing him like an old friend, though we had only just met. Then I headed back to the mainland, my mind quiet, my heart full. Coda. I returned to Chicago some weeks later. My colleagues in the chemistry department greeted me with mild curiosity and the usual academic politeness. Some asked if I'd found what I was looking for. I only smiled. How to explain that the answer was both yes and no, and that the question itself had dissolved? In my first lecture back, I faced a class of undergraduates. They expected me to talk about molecular geometry, valence bonds, or reaction kinetics, and so I did, at least for the first 45 minutes. But near the end, I paused. "There's something I want to share," I began, my voice a little shaky. "In the course of my sabbatical, I've come to believe that consciousness might be more than just an emergent phenomenon. It may be that matter arises from mind rather than mind from matter. But even that statement is incomplete. Perhaps mind and matter are two ways of describing the same ineffable reality." A few students looked puzzled, others intrigued. I continued softly. "Remember this phrase: there is no physics in dreams. It doesn't mean that physics is meaningless. It means that everything we call physics unfolds within a greater mystery, one that might be consciousness itself." I let the silence settle before concluding. "Just keep that in mind as you move through your studies and your life. The equations are useful, but they're not the final word. Reality is bigger, maybe infinitely bigger, than we can ever pin down with any single model." The bell rang, and the students filed out, some wearing expressions of wonder, others of mild confusion. I stood there, gazing at the empty seats, feeling a wave of gratitude. My depression had lifted in a way I couldn't entirely explain. Perhaps it was because I no longer felt trapped in a cold, dead universe of blind particles. Instead, I had glimpsed a universe alive with meaning, a cosmic dream woven by a consciousness that included me, every other being, and the simplest wave on a shore. As I walked through the corridors of the old chemistry building, I felt the ghosts of my old certainties fade. In their place blossomed a humble acceptance that the ultimate nature of reality might always remain beyond the grasp of any single discipline, any single mind. Yet that was not a tragedy. It was a testament to the boundless creativity of the dreamer, the universal mind of which we are all expressions. Outside, snow was falling lightly. I watched the flakes drift in the wind, each unique crystal a tiny miracle of form and emptiness. Somewhere in the back of my consciousness, a subtle whisper reminded me, the dream and the dreamer are one. And with that, I tucked my hands into my coat pockets, stepped into the gentle swirl of snow, and walked on, content to let the mystery guide me wherever it wished.
Thought forces make a mind create the illusion of time. Walls upon walls swirling to dark energy at night, dark night that we cannot see or comprehend. Physics is reality's background. We live in a multiverse of possibilities. A equals MC squared is the defining parameters of what we can know. Nothing is out of infinity beyond.